Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's victim story, I know it's annoying, but I need to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel here. I'm a new and small channel on YouTube, as you can see, and a simple click on the like button can help me a lot. So please subscribe to support me, click the like button and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Now, let's get to the case. Megan Davis had always felt a deep connection to the water. The rhythm of her strokes, the salty breeze on her face, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, everything about the ocean felt natural. At 40 years old, she was, in peak physical condition, a seasoned open-water swimmer who had trained in conditions from cold, choppy waters to calm, tropical seas. But today, as she stood on the edge of the beach, preparing for her daily training session, she had a feeling that something was different. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden light over the Gulf of Mexico. The water was calm, the kind of glassy stillness that made it feel like a perfect morning for a long swim. Megan adjusted her goggles and pulled her wetsuit over her lithe frame, taking a deep breath as she gazed out at the horizon. The beach was nearly empty. A few early morning joggers meandered along the shoreline, but for the most part it was just her and the open ocean. She checked her watch. It was 6:15 a.m. The lifeguard hut in the distance had a small sign posted about shark sightings in the area, but Megan didn't give it more than a passing glance. It was common, especially this time of year, when the water warmed up and the sharks migrated closer to shore. She had heard the warnings before, and they were always the same. Stay within designated swimming areas. Be cautious. Sharks have been spotted. She shrugged it off. She had swum here for years and nothing had ever happened. Besides, there were no other swimmers around, no one to worry about. She liked it that way. There was something peaceful about being alone in the vastness of the ocean, the open water stretching endlessly in every direction. "All right, let's do this," she muttered to herself, nodding as if giving herself a final approval. She waded into the water, feeling the cool rush against her legs as the surf rolled in. The first few steps were always the hardest, especially when the water was still cold, but Megan had long since become accustomed to the shock of it. She submerged herself up to her chest and began to swim. The salt water stung her eyes for a moment, but she blinked it away, adjusting her goggles as she began to build up a steady rhythm. Her arms moved with precision, cutting through the water with practiced grace. The swells were small today, nothing more than gentle rises and falls of the water. She felt like she was gliding through the surface. The further she swam, the more detached she became from the world behind her. The sandy beach, the distant voices of the joggers, the faint outline of the lifeguard stand. Out here, it was just her and the ocean. She loved the feeling of the open water, how it forced her to focus solely on herself, on the technique of each stroke, on the slow, steady rhythm of her breathing. But there was a gnawing feeling in the back of her mind, a faint sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. She glanced over her shoulder, then turned her head to the left, scanning the horizon. The water was still undisturbed. A deep breath in, then exhaled slowly. "It's nothing, just nerves," she told herself. She had trained in far worse conditions. The ocean wasn't something to fear, it was something to conquer. As she swam further, her focus returned. Her arms began to feel a slight burn, but she welcomed it. She adjusted her stroke to compensate, keeping a steady pace. Time passed in an almost dreamlike state, with the only sounds being the soft splash of her hands cutting through the water and the occasional break of a wave. But then something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the water beneath her. She felt it deep down in her core, the strange sensation of something moving beneath the surface. Megan stopped mid-stroke, treading water for a moment, her eyes darting around as she tried to place the feeling. The ocean had a way of telling her when something was off, when the usual rhythm of the water had changed. It wasn't like the harmless swells or the ebb and flow of the tide. This was something different, something unsettling. "It's probably just a school of fish," she told herself, even though the thought didn't bring her any comfort. She had encountered schools of fish before, had even swum through them, but this felt different. There was a heaviness to the water, as If it were being disturbed by something much larger than a school of fish, Megan hesitated, her breath catching slightly. She scanned the water again. Everything appeared still, but the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She shook her head. "Stop it. You're being paranoid. You've been swimming here for years. There's nothing out there." She resumed her stroke, though her pace slowed just a little, as if her body was instinctively reacting to the discomfort in her gut. The water around her felt colder now, more foreboding, and she could see the faint outline of the deep blue, the depths of the ocean stretching far below. She glanced at the shore again, just a small dot in the distance. She was far enough out, now that if she needed help, it would take too long for anyone to reach her. She could still make it back easily, though. She was strong. She had done this countless times before. Then came the first sharp tug. Her body was jerked sideways, the sensation so sudden and forceful that it took her breath away. Megan gasped, her legs flailing beneath her as she kicked against the water, trying to regain control. A sharp, jagged pain shot through her side, and the water around her turned an alarming shade of red. She looked down in horror and saw the unmistakable shape of a fin cutting through the surface beneath her. It was large, far too large to be a simple fish. Her heart slammed in her chest, her mind reeling in panic. "No, no, no, no!" The shark lunged again, its powerful body surging through the water with terrifying speed. Megan screamed, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the ocean, her mind frozen in disbelief. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She wasn't supposed to be the one to become the victim. The water was now thick with blood, and the stench of metal and salt filled her nostrils. She could feel the shark circling beneath her, its presence unmistakable as it prowled. A part of her mind screamed at her to move, to swim, to get away, but the pain in her side was unbearable. The wound was deep. She could feel the warmth of it spreading through the water with every agonizing second. She tried to kick again, but the pain made her limbs feel like lead. Another surge of water beneath her. The shark was back closer now, its gaping mouth snapping inches away from her legs. In her panic, she kicked out, connecting with something hard. A momentary sense of triumph before the water surged again. The shark was relentless. A part of her mind kept shouting, "You need to survive. Get to shore." With every ounce of energy, she had left. Megan began to swim, though each stroke felt like it took everything from her. Blood clouded the water around her, but she could hear the faintest sound of a motor. Maybe a boat. No, she realized in a rush, it was the lifeguard's jet ski. Someone had seen her, someone was coming, but the shark wasn't finished. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, but soon the sound of the jet ski grew louder, and Megan was pulled onto the back of the lifeguard, her body limp and heavy with exhaustion. The shark, for reasons she couldn't understand, broke away. It retreated into the depths, disappearing into the ocean like a ghost. She barely remembered the ride to the shore, the paramedics working on her once they reached land. The pain was constant, but her mind was foggy, disoriented. She knew she was alive, but she couldn't shake the terror that had gripped her in those moments. The ocean had felt so safe once, so calming. Now, it felt like a predator's lair. Dessau. Last thing she heard before darkness took over was the lifeguard's voice. "You're gonna be all right. We've got you." But in her mind, the water still churned, dark and endless, and she wondered if she would ever feel safe in the ocean again. The morning had come with a chill, though it wasn't uncommon for Florida. Mornings to be cool before the sun heated everything up. Megan stood on the edge of the beach, her wetsuit hugging her body, her goggles perched on her forehead. The smell of salt water and damp sand filled the air. She gazed out across the Gulf, the waves lapping at the shore in a soothing rhythm, a promise of the quiet solitude she longed for in her training. The lifeguard station, just a short jog down. The beach looked like a distant relic in the early light. The red and white striped flags barely fluttered in the morning breeze. She didn't hear any of the usual chatter from the lifeguards yet. They wouldn't start their rounds until after 8, but she had caught the tail end of a conversation as she walked past. One of the younger lifeguards, Jake, was talking to another about some shark sightings the day before. Megan had barely listened. "Don't worry about it, it's just the usual warnings," she had heard him say. "They're probably just out near the deeper waters, you know." Jake was a local, A lifeguard for years, he had seen his share of shark warnings. He'd been on the beach through a few scares, but no attacks and no serious injuries. It was always the same routine. Sharks came closer to shore when the water warmed up, and the authorities put out warnings. But in his experience, those warnings were nothing more than safety precautions. Megan had learned to ignore them years ago. She felt the breeze on her face again, and for a moment, the air smelled different, less salty, a little heavier. Her senses sharpened, but she didn't think much of it. She was used to swimming alone, to training at the edges of the safe zones where few others dared to venture. There was something satisfying about it, a sense of mastery over the open water. She didn't even look up as she slid her goggles on and stepped into the water, feeling the cool rush of it swallow her legs and then her waist. Her body tensed as she adjusted to the initial shock of the temperature. The water was a little cooler than usual for this time of year, but nothing unusual. It felt fine. Her arms cut through the water in smooth strokes as she gradually eased herself further into the gulf. The gentle push and pull of the waves beneath her seemed almost meditative, the repetition of it all so familiar. She had done this countless times. Alone in the morning light, when no one else was around, the surface of the water was calm, stretching out in a flat expanse of deep blue. The rising sun painted the sky with streaks of orange and gold, the light beginning to glint off the water in a dazzling display of color. Megan took a deep breath and plunged her head beneath the surface, pushing against the water with strong, controlled strokes. She could feel the rhythm of her movements, the burn in her arms as she picked up speed. She was focused, only thinking of the feel of the water, the movement of her limbs, the calming pulse of each stroke. But then something changed. She couldn't place it at first. A faint shift in the water, a subtle change, barely noticeable. It was almost imperceptible, like the difference between the warmth of the air and the coolness of the water. For a moment, she thought it was just a natural variation in the current. But then she felt it again. Something colder, a shift in the water's temperature that wasn't there before. Megan paused, floating on her back for a moment, her eyes scanning the water. The horizon was still just as it had been, the same gentle curve of the coastline, the same emptiness of the open sea. There was no sign of anything unusual, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of her mind. Something was off. The calmness of the water felt almost unnatural. A shadow passed beneath her. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her heart rate spike. She immediately pushed herself back into a freestyle stroke, her gaze darting toward the distant shore. Could it have been a boat, she wondered? But the water was too clear, too still, nothing in the distance. No motor sound, no wake from a passing vessel. She paused again, floating, her legs treading water nervously now. Her mind raced. Could it have been a fish? A school of them? She pushed the thought out. She had been swimming in these waters for over a decade, and she'd seen plenty of fish. Sharks, though, those were rare sightings. And Megan knew deep down that if there was one thing she could always count on, it was that the sharks kept their distance. She wasn't a fish and she wasn't a seal. She was just a swimmer, and that made her invisible to them. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The stillness of the ocean had shifted into something else, something less peaceful, more anticipatory. She felt exposed, isolated in a way that she hadn't before. A voice rang through her mind. Jake's voice from earlier. "Don't worry about it," he'd said. "Just the usual warnings." But as she drifted in the water, Megan couldn't ignore the small voice of doubt creeping into her thoughts. What if this wasn't like the usual warnings? What if there was more to it? Megan shook her head and forced herself to focus. "You're just overthinking," she told herself. "It's fine. It's just another swim." Focus. She began swimming again, a little faster this time, propelling herself through the water with an urgency she hadn't felt before. But it was when she took another stroke, when she twisted her body to reach forward with her right arm, that she felt it, a jarring tug from below, something cold and sharp, grabbing her foot. A shriek of panic caught in her throat as she kicked hard, trying to pull away. But the grip was too strong. She felt her foot being dragged down into the depths. The water around her seemed to darken, the movement of it heavy and unnatural. Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. It was impossible to think, to process what was happening. She kicked again, harder this time, and the grip loosened slightly, but only for a moment. Then, with a ferocity she had never experienced, the pull intensified, dragging her deeper. Shark! The word flashed in her mind like a lightning strike, but there was no time for the thought to fully form. A wave of terror slammed into her as her body was yanked under, her vision a whirl of blue water and her pulse thundering in her ears. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the sea. Instinct kicked in. She twisted, thrashing against the water, her arms flailing in panic. Something sharp scraped against her leg, a searing pain that made her cry out. She reached down, but there was nothing to grab onto, no surface to push off. The world spun. Everything became a blur of motion and fear. She kicked, she flailed, but it was like trying to fight against a current stronger than she was. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the grip released. Megan shot up to the surface, gasping for air, her heart in her throat. She could feel the blood pouring from her leg, warm and thick. The water around her turned red. Her eyes darted frantically over the water, searching for the thing that had pulled her under. The ocean seemed impossibly still. There was no sign of the creature, no shadow beneath the surface, no movement. She floated, trembling, her breath shallow and ragged. Every part of her screamed to swim back to shore, to get to safety, but her body wouldn't respond. All she could do was wait and pray. Megan had been swimming for nearly half an hour when she first noticed something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She paused for a moment, her strokes slowing as she glanced down into the water. The usual clarity was gone. The surface below her was murky, swirling with light blue and dark green streaks. The sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows, but the depth seemed unnaturally opaque today. The ocean had its moods, and Megan had learned to trust her instincts, so when she felt the shift in the water temperature, a sudden drop, like a cold draft moving through her body, she stopped. She was treading water now, her arms and legs moving slowly to keep her afloat as she scanned the surface. Something was off. She couldn't explain it, but she had learned over the years that the ocean was rarely unpredictable without a reason. She heard the faintest splash behind her, a distant sound, like something had disturbed the surface. But when she turned, around there was nothing, just the wide expanse of water stretching to the horizon. The wind had picked up a little, though it wasn't enough to cause any real waves. Still, the water felt heavier, almost charged. She could feel the weight of it all pressing in around her. "Get it together, Megan," she muttered to herself, tightening the straps of her goggles. She had been here countless times before, alone, in the water. It was her sanctuary. She was stronger than any of this. Yet her heart began to beat a little faster. She resumed swimming, but now she found herself glancing over her shoulder more frequently, almost expecting to see something, anything that didn't belong. There was nothing. The water remained, calm and clear, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of her mind. She took a deep breath, trying to focus, but as the minutes ticked by, the water seemed to get darker, more oppressive, and the silence stretched a little too long. A sudden movement caught her eye, a shadow darting across the sea floor far beneath her. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The shadow was too big, too fast, and too deliberate to be just a fish. She froze, treading water now, her pulse quickening as she scanned the water. The surface rippled again, this time closer, but still nothing. Could it be a school of fish? She tried to convince herself of that. She had seen fish dart in and out of the sunlight many times. But something in her gut told her otherwise. It wasn't just the water that had shifted. It was her instincts, those deep ancient instincts that told her that something large was out there, something with purpose, something that was hunting. She tried to dismiss the feeling. There had been no warning signs of sharks recently, not that she had noticed. Nothing on the news, no reports from the lifeguards. She was too experienced to fall for her imagination running wild, but still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being out of place in a way she couldn't quite explain. Her breaths came a little faster now, but she forced herself to focus. Just then, the water seemed to shift again. She felt something, a sudden sharp pull on the water. It was like a current, but different, like a vacuum had opened up beneath her. Megan looked down, her heart in her throat. Then, it happened. The water erupted below her in an explosive burst of white foam and spray. It was like a thunderclap beneath the surface, but there was no thunder. Just the deafening roar of a predator emerging from the depths. A massive force collided with her leg, a pain so sudden and sharp that it felt like someone had jammed a knife into her thigh. She screamed, her body involuntarily lurching as the water around her churned with violence. Her goggles were knocked askew, her vision blurring. She kicked desperately, but the pain in her leg intensified, and she realized with sickening clarity that something had hold of her. No. Her mind raced as she twisted and thrashed in the water, trying to break free, but the grip on her leg was relentless. Her first instinct was to fight back, to kick harder, to push, to escape, but the force pulling her down was overwhelming. It felt like the water itself had turned into a trap, dragging her toward some unseen predator below. She could hear nothing but her own heartbeat pounding in her ears and the frantic rush of water. Her leg burned with searing pain, and her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Shark. The word cut through the fog of panic. It's a shark. Her heart surged with terror. She kicked again, harder this time, but it was as though the thing holding her was not just a creature of muscle and tooth, but of pure instinct. It was too strong, too fast. Another violent pull, and this time she felt the weight of it, the sheer power of a creature built to hunt. She was being dragged beneath the surface. The water around her turned murky with blood, her blood splashing up like a signal to the predator. She kicked again, this time frantically, her body surging forward in a desperate attempt to break free. But it wasn't enough. She was dragged deeper. The world above her seemed to vanish as the water closed in. Her lungs burned, her body screaming for air, but there was nothing to grasp onto. No lifeline, no rescue in sight. Her vision went black at the edges, but she kept kicking, kept fighting. She had to. She couldn't let herself go under. She couldn't. A new sensation, a terrible pulsing pressure hit her chest, and for a split second, the grip on her leg loosened. It's not over. It's not over. With every last ounce of strength, Megan pulled herself toward the surface. She could see the sunlight again, the water above her turning lighter, her breath ragged and desperate as she broke through the surface, gasping for air. But the nightmare wasn't over, not by a long shot. Her leg was bleeding, and the water around her was red, swirling with the bright shock of it. A dark shape loomed just below, circling, waiting. She couldn't see it fully, but she didn't need to. She had felt it, and now the sense of terror hit her all over again. The shark wasn't finished. It was still there. Megan's arms moved. Desperate, but she knew she wasn't fast enough. She wasn't strong enough. She wasn't going to make it. The water splashed again, a ripple that felt like the end, and she turned to face it, her heart in her throat. But instead of an attack, the water stilled. The predator, having taken what it wanted, disappeared beneath the surface in a flash of dark, violent speed, vanishing back into the deep, leaving Megan floating in the bloody aftermath. She was alone. For a moment, the silence seemed almost peaceful, as if the ocean had taken pity on her. But the silence was soon broken by her own labored breathing. She looked down at her leg, a torn mess of flesh and blood, her wetsuit shredded. The pain was overwhelming, but it didn't matter. She was alive, for now. With what remained of her strength, Megan began to kick weakly, her arms pulling her toward the shore. Every stroke, every movement felt like an eternity. She fought through the pain, the fear, the shock, pushing herself closer and closer to the distant shore, the sound of the waves like a cruel reminder of how far she still had to go. And in that moment, the terror was not just in the attack itself, but in the realization that she had survived. But for how long? Megan's heart began to race as she swam, the unease settling deep in her gut. Every stroke, every breath felt suddenly too loud, too noticeable, like the world around her had grown still and heavy. The water, once warm and welcoming, now seemed cold and distant. The vastness of the ocean, which she had always found peaceful, felt overwhelming. For a moment she wished she hadn't dismissed those warnings. She kicked harder, forcing herself to focus. Stay calm, she told herself. It's probably nothing. Maybe a school of fish or a distant dolphin. The ocean's full of strange things, but there was something about the silence that gnawed at her. It came again, the splash, this time louder, closer. Her breath hitched in her throat as she instinctively twisted her body to look behind her. There was nothing. Nothing but the swells of water, rolling in steady intervals, each one rising higher than the last. Megan's pulse quickened. She stopped swimming, treading water now, her hands slicing through the surface as she searched the water. It was a game of trust, or perhaps a game of survival. Trust in her instincts, in her experience, in the knowledge that she could handle whatever came. But as the seconds passed, the feeling of being watched intensified. She glanced back toward the shore. It seemed so far now, too far. Her mind began to race. Maybe I'm overreacting. Just get a grip, Megan. Just a few more strokes. Get to the buoy. Get to the buoy. The buoy, which seemed like it was a lifetime away, marked the halfway point of her swim. A small orange dot on the horizon that was supposed to be a beacon of safety. But now it felt like a trap. The splash came again, and this time, Megan didn't turn around. She knew what it was. She could feel it in the water, the shift, the pressure. It was something big. She had no proof, no evidence, but her body told her everything she needed to know. Something was moving beneath her. And it was. Close, too close. Her breathing became erratic as her arms began to tremble with exertion. She forced herself to stay calm. Don't panic. Don't panic. The words repeated like a chant in her mind. But how could she not? It was that deep, primal instinct. Something was lurking below her, something that didn't belong in her world. Suddenly, the water below her seemed to erupt, the surface breaking with a force that made her gasp. She barely had time to react. A massive shadow shot up from the depths, a powerful burst of movement in the clear water. A fin, and then a monstrous, gaping maw that tore through the surface, with a violence Megan could not comprehend. The bull shark was on her in an instant. It was a blur of motion, so fast, so sudden. Its body rose from the depths, jaws wide, teeth gleaming in the sunlight. The sheer force of it took Megan's breath away, but it wasn't the shark that hit her first. It was the impact of the water as it exploded around her. She screamed, a guttural sound that mixed with the splashing chaos as she felt the pressure of something massive coming toward her. The shark's body was a blur of muscle and sheer aggression. Its mouth, open wide, closed on her leg before she could react. A searing pain tore through her thigh as the shark's teeth sunk in deep, snapping bone and muscle. Her body was yanked. Under, the water churning violently around her. Megan kicked, thrashing, her arms desperate to break free of the shark's grip. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, a frantic rhythm that threatened to suffocate her. The pain in her leg was unbearable, burning, pulsing, spreading with every twist of the shark's jaws. She could feel the weight of it dragging her downward, pulling her deeper into the dark abyss. The water, once comforting and familiar, now felt like a tomb. Megan gasped for air, but the shark wouldn't let go. She twisted her body, trying to free her leg, but it was useless. The pain was blinding, her thoughts scrambled. I'm going to drown. I'm going to die here. No, don't think like that. You've trained for this. You're strong, fight. Her arms burned from the frantic paddling, but there was no escape. The shark was pulling her further under, dragging her toward the dark depths where the sunlight could no longer reach. She had to do something, anything, before it took her completely. With every ounce of energy she had left, she brought her fists down onto the shark's snout, hitting it with everything she had. Her hands were numb from the shock, but she kept striking over and over, hoping for something, anything, to make the predator let go. She couldn't hear herself screaming anymore. All she could hear was the rush of water, the thud of her own heartbeat, and the eerie guttural growls of the shark. But nothing worked. The shark twisted, suddenly releasing its grip on her leg. The change in pressure sent Megan rocketing to the surface, gasping for air, her chest heaving with desperate, panicked breaths. Blood clouded the water around her, turning the once clear gulf into a red-tinted nightmare. I'm free. I'm alive. But she didn't have time to celebrate her escape. The shark was still there, circling, its fin cutting through the water like a black blade. Megan's brain was on fire, the pain in her leg searing like a hot poker. She could feel the blood draining, the weight of it pulling her under. But she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. Not now. The shore was still so far away. The buoy felt like it was miles off, and the pain was unbearable. Her head was spinning, the world tilting as the shark closed in again. She kicked her legs weakly at first, but then with more force. She had no other choice. Keep moving. Keep moving. The shark's movements were calculated, stalking, waiting. It hadn't finished with her. It was studying her, circling again and again, waiting for another opening. She could see it now, its huge body slicing through the water. Just beneath the surface, its dark, glassy eyes tracking her every move. It was intelligent, relentless. This was its world. Megan was nothing more than prey. Help, she cried, her voice a hoarse rasp. But the shore was too far. The lifeguards, the beachgoers, they couldn't hear her, couldn't see her. She was alone. The shark surged forward again, but this time she had a brief moment of clarity. With a final instinctual burst of energy, Megan kicked hard, her legs screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She pushed herself through the water, one stroke at a time, heading for the shoreline with every ounce of strength she had left. The shark lingered, hovering just below her, but it didn't strike again. Just as she was about to give up, just as the exhaustion almost swallowed her whole, the distant sound of a motor reached her ears. A boat. A lifeguard boat. Help, please. She screamed again, her voice cracking. She could feel the blood in the water, the warmth of it seeping through the ocean's cool embrace. Her body was giving up, but she couldn't. Not yet. The boat appeared out of nowhere, the lifeguard leaning over the side, grabbing her just as she was about to slip beneath the waves once more. Megan was struggling to breathe now, the ocean, swallowing her in ways that she didn't understand. The fear that had begun as a gnawing sensation had bloomed into something darker, something all-encompassing. She could feel the water around her moving differently, as though it was no longer simply reacting to the wind or her strokes, but responding to something else beneath the surface, something that was alive. She tried to steady herself, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing, but the unease in her gut only grew stronger with each passing second. It's just a dolphin, she told herself again. Maybe it's just a shadow or a stingray, nothing to panic over. But the feeling of being followed, of being watched, didn't go away. The water was suddenly colder, the current stronger. It tugged at her limbs, pulling her slightly off course. Megan fought it, her body moving in a familiar stroke, but it felt more like a struggle than an effortless glide. The shadows beneath the surface had become darker now, their shapes more pronounced. They weren't fish. She knew fish, knew how schools of them swirled below. This was different. Then it happened. The sensation came first, a sudden violent rush of water beneath her. The ocean around her exploded as something massive, something powerful, surged from below. Megan had no time to react. One moment she was treading water. The next, her entire body was yanked backward, dragged under, her feet kicking wildly, her arms flailing, her breath lost in a torrent of salt water. The pain came next. A flash of agony shot through her right leg, a pressure that felt like steel clamping down. She screamed, but the water muffled the sound, her voice lost in the depths. Her body was being pulled downward, deeper, faster than she could process. She instinctively kicked harder, her hands scrabbling at the water, trying to break free. But the force was too strong. Through the blurry haze of water and fear, she saw it. A massive shape, grey and sleek, with a powerful, gaping mouth filled with rows of jagged teeth. The beast's body surged through the water in a blur, a flash of muscle and speed. She had no time to react. It was happening too fast, and the pain in her leg intensified with each thrash. The shark, she realized in a moment of pure, paralyzing terror, wasn't just toying with her. It had her, and it wasn't going to let go. Megan's vision blurred, and her mind fought against the panic that was taking over. This is it. This is it. I'm going to die. She didn't know what else to do except thrash, kicking and pulling, trying to free herself from the shark's grip. But her leg was pinned. The pain was excruciating. With a burst of adrenaline, she managed to get her head above water. She gasped for air, her chest tight with panic, but the shark was still below her. It was waiting for her next move. The cold, raw fear that gripped her heart made it nearly impossible to think. She had to get to the shore. She had to survive. Her instincts kicked in. Megan kicked again, harder now, trying to swim, but the shark was fast, faster than she was. It surged again from the depths, and this time it came for her head. The water around her exploded and she screamed, pushing herself upward, her arms thrashing as she fought the pull of the ocean, the weight of the beast below her. She couldn't see it now, but she could feel it, its presence like a shadow beneath the waves, waiting. "Help! Help!" Megan screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the sea, the words muffled by the water that filled her mouth, her throat, and her lungs. She could feel the ocean pulling her down again. She was no longer fighting a swim, she was fighting for her life. Another surge of pain. A sharp, searing sensation. The shark had bitten again. This time, it wasn't her leg. It was her side. Her ribs felt like they were going to snap under the force of its bite. The water around her turned red, a shocking splash of color in the otherwise grey-blue sea. Megan felt herself weakening, her body becoming heavier, each stroke more laborious than the last. Her thoughts grew foggy, and panic tightened around her chest like a vice. "Please, God, please," she whispered through gasps of breath. She couldn't hear anything over the rush of the waves. The water seemed to close in on her as she struggled to stay afloat, her body no longer responding to her commands. Every movement felt slower, more desperate. The shark seemed to circle her now. Megan was aware of it, a dark shadow below, a predator playing with its prey. "Don't stop. Don't give up. Keep fighting, keep fighting." But she couldn't see the shore. She couldn't see anything but water, the waves crashing around her in an unforgiving rhythm. Every time she lifted her head above the water to scream, she felt it, the pull, the pressure of the shark below her. Every splash, every violent movement only dragged her deeper into the depths. The next wave that hit her was different. It wasn't the crash of a swell, the gentle roll of the tide. It was the violent splash of someone else. A boat. A flash of light broke the surface. Megan blinked, her eyes wide, struggling to focus. There was a person, a figure, a voice, a shout. "Hey, we're here, hold on." A hand, a rope. The familiar feel of human touch. She didn't know how, but somehow she had made it. Through sheer will, through instinct, she grabbed onto the rope thrown to her by a pair of rescuers in a small boat. Her body was numb, her limbs weak and unresponsive, but she clung to the lifeline with all the strength she had left. The boat jerked as the crew pulled her in, their voices frantic, their hands grabbing her arms to lift her aboard. But all she could focus on was the water, the depths and the faint shape beneath her, retreating into the ocean. The shark had disappeared into the darkness. Megan didn't know if it was gone for good or if it was still out there, waiting. "Are you okay?" one of the rescuers asked, but Megan couldn't answer. She was trembling, her body racked with pain. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt distant now, as though she were floating in and out of consciousness. "Just hold on," the other rescuer said. "You're safe now, we've got you, you're safe." Megan closed her eyes, the world around her spinning. She heard the sounds of the boat's engine, the waves crashing against its sides. But it all felt muffled, distant. The terror was still there, a raw echo in her mind. But the shark was gone. For now. Megan's world collapsed into chaos. Her body was pulled under the surface with a force that left her disoriented, her head spinning. The ocean, which had always been a place of serenity and control, was now an enemy, thrashing violently around her. She gasped for air, but the salt water rushed into her mouth, filling her lungs. Her hands reached out instinctively, desperate, for something to grasp. But there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, relentless water. In those first few moments, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. Her thoughts scattered. What happened? What's happening? Then the pressure came. Her legs were seized by something powerful, sharp, and the realization hit her with a sickening jolt. She wasn't alone. A massive, crushing weight yanked her. Downward again, dragging her further into the depths. The world around her turned dark, the sunlight dimming as she descended. The sounds of the ocean, the gentle swells, the distant calls of seagulls, were replaced by a haunting stillness. It felt like she was sinking into an abyss and she couldn't escape. Shark. The thought hit her with the clarity of a punch. It's a shark. Megan had seen the documentaries, the photos, the warnings posted at every beach she had ever swum at, but no amount of knowledge or training had prepared her for the reality of it, this raw, unrelenting terror that coursed through her veins as her body was jerked one more time. She kicked out hard, her legs burning with the effort. She could feel the resistance beneath her, the mass of something large, beneath her. Her mind was fighting for control, pushing against the instinct to panic, but it was impossible. The sheer terror was overwhelming. A sickening, sharp pain exploded in her left thigh, followed by a violent jolt as something tore through the muscle. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the water. Blood swirled around her, a stark contrast against the blue of the ocean. "No, no, no, no!" She kicked harder, her hands thrashing, trying to break free, but each time she thought she might escape, the force pulled her back, closer to the sharp, jagged shape that had seized her. It was a bull shark, massive and unrelenting, and it had her. The pain in her leg was excruciating. Her mind raced. "Focus, focus. You know what to do. You've trained for this. You've trained for survival." Megan's arms flailed, her legs struggling, but the shark had latched onto her. She had no time to think, only to survive. Her eyes were wide, scanning, searching for any sign of escape. She could feel the weight of its body beneath her, moving, circling, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The blood continued to leak from her leg, a trail in the water, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the shark came in for another attack. The pain was spreading now, her muscles trembling with the effort to fight, to stay above the surface, to keep from sinking into the blackness. But every moment she remained in the water was another moment she risked becoming prey. Think, her. Arms shot forward in a desperate stroke, but it wasn't enough to break free. She was still too far from shore. The faint outline of the beach was there, a distant reminder of safety, but it might as well have been miles away. Her only hope was to get to the surface, to break free from the shark's grip long enough to take a breath, and then, like a twist of fate, the shark let go. For a fraction of a second, Megan was weightless, suspended in the water, the pressure on her body released. The sharp sting in her leg remained, but she didn't have time to process the damage. The shark had retreated, but only to circle again. The ocean swirled around her as she kicked with all the strength she had left, moving toward the surface. Her head broke through the water, and she gasped for air, filling her lungs with a desperate, greedy breath. "Help!" she screamed, but the sound was little more than a rasp swallowed by the waves. Her vision was blurred with salt water, and the pain in her leg was blinding, but there was no time to think. She had to move. Her body was trembling, her limbs shaking uncontrollably, but she forced herself to keep swimming, to push herself forward, though the shoreline still felt impossibly far away. Every stroke, every kick felt like it might be her last, and yet she knew she couldn't stop. If she stopped, the shark would finish what it had started. It was then that she saw it, the shadow moving beneath her again, just below the surface. The massive shape circling, its fin cutting through the water like a blade. Megan's heart lurched in her chest as she forced herself to focus. The shark was closing in. She could feel it, could hear the faint splashes of its movements. It was getting closer, too close. Think, Megan, think. She had to escape, but how? She was too far out. No one would hear her scream. No one would get to her in time. Suddenly the water erupted beneath her. The shark struck again, its massive jaws snapping shut around her right leg this time. The force was overwhelming, and Megan screamed in agony as the teeth sank deep, shredding through muscle and flesh. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her leg felt like it was on fire, the blood pouring from the wound in thick, dark streams, coloring the water around her. This was it. This was how it ended. But something inside her fought back. The primal part of her, the part that refused to give in to fear, kicked in. With a strength she didn't know she had left, she thrashed, yanking her leg from the shark's jaws with a scream of sheer willpower. She pushed herself up, desperately reaching for the surface. The shark let go, but not for long. Megan broke. Through the surface, gasping for air, her body a raw, trembling mess. Her vision was blurred, the pain in her leg intense, but she could see the shoreline now. Close, so close. Every instinct told her to swim, to get there. She had to make it. Her limbs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. But she fought against it, kicking with everything she had left. The pain in her leg was unbearable, but the fear of being dragged under again, of never making it, was worse. Behind her, the shark circled again, its dark silhouette gliding through the water. Megan's heart raced, each beat a drum of pure survival. She didn't look back. "Help," she whispered between ragged breaths, though she knew no one could hear her. She had to make it to shore. She had to. The shark was still there, waiting. But she was too close now, too close to give up. And then, through the haze of pain and fear, she saw them. The lifeguards, a boat, the distant flash of yellow vests. Her vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't the ocean that threatened to pull her under. It was the relief, the overwhelming sensation of safety that crashed over her. Just a little further. Megan fought, her body moving on pure instinct. Panic was a distant thought. Adrenaline was all she had. She kicked furiously, her arms flailing as she tried to break free from the massive grip of the creature below her. It was like being held in the jaws of an invisible predator. The pressure, squeezing her, forcing the air out of her chest. Her heart was hammering, her limbs frozen with the fear of what was happening and the fear of what would come next. Her legs were no longer just being dragged down, they were being bitten. She felt it now, sharp, excruciating pain tearing through her right calf. The bite came in two powerful, crushing clamps, the pressure so intense that it felt like the muscle and bone were being crushed together. She couldn't scream. The force of the pull was too strong, too swift, too overwhelming. Megan's vision blurred as the pain exploded in her leg, blood rushing into the water around her, staining it red. She was sinking, her body no longer rising with the natural rhythm of the waves. The ocean seemed to close in on her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but be here, helpless in the grip of something far stronger than she could ever be. Her mouth opened, but only salt water poured in, suffocating her further. "I'm going to die here." The thought pierced through the haze of fear and pain, sharp and undeniable. Megan's body jerked again, pulled down farther as the shark released her leg, only to twist and grab at it once more, this time sinking its teeth into the flesh of her thigh. The jagged, brutal tearing sensation nearly made her lose her grip. On her will to fight. She had never felt anything like this before, not in any race, not in any challenge. This was raw terror, and it was too much. Her hands reached down, instinctively trying to push the creature away, but she couldn't find anything. There was nothing to grab, nothing to defend herself with. It was just her and the shark in the vast empty sea. No. No. I can't die here. I can't die like this. Her leg was a blur of agony, the pain radiating through her body with every pulse of the shark's attack. She tried to kick again, to push herself upward, but the shark's grip was unrelenting. She could feel its weight on her, dragging her lower, deeper, further away from the surface. For a moment, her brain screamed for escape, but her body was exhausted. She was running out of energy, running out of time. The water around her began to swirl. It wasn't the ocean itself that was creating the turbulence, it was the shark. The predator was circling, coming back for another strike. Megan's mind raced, frantically searching for anything that could save her. The surface was so far above, the distance too great, and the shark, with its relentless circles, was keeping her trapped. The feeling of being hunted, of being prey, was overwhelming. With one last desperate effort, Megan flailed her arms, twisting her body in the water, trying to break free of the shark's deadly grip. Her hands connected with something. The buoy. It wasn't far, just a few meters away. She kicked with everything she had left, her muscles screaming in protest, but the pain in her legs made her feel like she was swimming through molasses. She could feel the creature below her, just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. Her vision was fading. The edges of her world began to close in as her body grew weaker, and she feared that at any moment she might lose consciousness. The buoy grew closer, closer, and then, with a final desperate push, Megan reached it, grabbing the rope with both hands. She clung to it like a lifeline. Her fingers wrapped around the thick nylon, her grip slipping, but she held on, pulling herself toward the small floating structure. The shark was still there. She could feel it just beneath the surface, the tension of its proximity sharp and terrifying. But it didn't attack again. Not yet. Megan's breath came in shallow, painful gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, and the pain in her leg was so intense it made her dizzy. Blood continued to mix with the water around her, swirling in dark, crimson patterns. She tried to pull herself higher to find some safety, but her body was weak, trembling with shock. Her mind was hazy, clouded by the trauma, and all she could focus on was the thought of the shark coming back for another attack. She could hear her pulse in her ears, the roar of her breath as it forced its way in and out of her lungs. The buoy was solid beneath her, and for a moment the terror was a distant hum, something far removed from the brutal immediacy of the shark's jaws. But she didn't know how long she could hold on. A voice, a shout, "Hold on, just hold on." Megan turned her head, and through the fog of fear she saw him, Jake, the lifeguard. He was paddling toward her, his body tense with urgency as he fought against the waves. He was shouting at her again, but the words were distorted, lost in the roaring rush of the ocean and the shock that gripped her. "Hold on," he shouted again, closer now. She could see him clearly, his face contorted in a mix of panic and determination. He reached out, grabbing the rope of the buoy. Megan opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't find her voice. Instead, she let go of the buoy for a moment, grabbing Jake's outstretched arm. The movement felt like it took all the strength she had left. She tried to pull herself toward him, but her leg was a mess of pain and shock. Jake pulled harder, his hands locking onto hers, the urgency in his grip enough to force her body upward. "You're okay. You're okay. Just hold on," he said, his voice calm but thick with tension. He was talking to himself as much as to her. The shark was still circling. It was only a matter of time before it came back. Megan's vision swam. She could barely keep her eyes open, her body trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. The sea seemed to be pulling at her, trying to drag her back. Her mind was fading. But she heard Jake shout again, this time over his shoulder, and she knew that help was on the way. He had to get her back to shore. She had to survive. Her body went limp as he hauled her closer to the paddleboard, his arms wrapping around her like a lifeline. The shark was still there, lurking just beneath the waves. But she was no longer alone. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Megan's body lurched with the second strike. The shark had returned, its presence undeniable, a force of nature that would not let go. Her leg burned with pain, but this time the fear had twisted into something more primal, pure. Survival. She had felt its teeth once, tasted the sharp, brutal sensation, but the second bite, it wasn't a bite. It was a full-bodied attack, a sudden, violent slam of weight and muscle, thrusting her deeper into the darkened water. No, 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 no. Her mind screamed, but her body could barely keep up. The ocean held her tight in its cold, inescapable embrace. She was already beneath the surface, the depths around her seeming endless, suffocating. Megan thrashed, kicking her legs and punching the water with her fists. She had to fight. She had to survive. Her right leg, throbbing with each beat of her heart, was no longer in her control. The pain was beyond anything she had ever felt. Every movement sent white-hot waves of agony coursing through her. In the midst of her panic, the shark let go. For a moment, she was free. The absence of pressure was disorienting. But before she could make sense of what had happened, the water around her shifted. She knew the shark was still there. She could feel it circling her, its presence unmistakable. She took a breath, but the salt water threatened to choke her. Panic threatened to consume her, but her survival instincts flared. Get to the surface. Get air. Get help. Megan kicked, trying to push herself upward, but her injured leg wouldn't cooperate. Every time she tried to move it, the pain ripped through her like 1,000 knives. She had to use her arms to compensate, pulling herself up the water's surface with desperate strokes. The world around her felt impossibly still, and yet she could sense the predator beneath, moving just out of sight, waiting. It was as if it was toying with her, letting her think she might escape before it came in for the final strike. Please, please. The thought pulsed through her mind, the raw plea cutting through the storm of fear. The surface. Her eyes broke through the water with a gasp. A desperate, choked breath filled her lungs. But as she blinked against the spray of salt water, she saw only vast ocean in front of her. She was alone. Where is everyone? There was no boat, no lifeguard, no person anywhere in sight. The beach was a distant line of sand far behind her. The shore seemed unreachable, like a dream that was fading as fast as her strength. She turned, searching the water, looking for any sign of the shark. Her vision was blurred from the salt water and the overwhelming pain in her leg. But there it was, the unmistakable dark silhouette beneath her. It was circling, watching. A jolt of terror gripped her chest, and she tried to swim again. She kicked hard with her uninjured leg, but the effort was weak. Her body was slowing down. Her movements were sluggish, strained. The shark seemed to sense it, its movements growing bolder, more calculated. She wasn't sure if it had tasted blood or if it was just instinct, but it didn't matter. She was its prey now. Her mind scrambled. She had read everything. She knew what to do in the event of an attack. At least she thought she did. Theories, tips. You're supposed to keep eye contact. Make yourself look bigger. Fight back. But none of that seemed relevant in the moment. None of it worked when you were in the water with a predator that had no fear, no hesitation. Megan's survival was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Suddenly, the water exploded around her. The shark launched itself upward, its massive body cutting through the water with terrifying speed. Its dorsal fin broke the surface just inches from her, the force of the attack slamming into her side. The impact was crushing, knocking her sideways in the water. She lost her bearings. She had no idea which way was up, which way was down. Her head was spinning, her heart hammering in her chest. The shark was so close now, so close that she could almost feel its hot breath. A second passed, a split second, and then the shark struck again. Its body thrashed against her, knocking her down, forcing her face into the water. Megan's arms flailed, her hands trying to push it away, but there was no strength left. She was too tired. Her lungs burned, her vision swam with black spots. I can't fight it anymore. I can't. The shark sank back beneath the surface, disappearing as quickly as it had come. She had been shoved sideways again, but she could feel the presence of the predator still circling beneath her. She had no idea where it was now. Was it just waiting? Waiting for her to sink? Megan wasn't sure how long she could hold on, but she knew she had to. Stay alive, stay alive. But her body was giving out. Her leg, her mangled, bleeding leg, was dragging her down. Her breath was ragged, her arms heavy. She tried to keep herself afloat, but it was getting harder with each passing second. She couldn't do this alone. She couldn't survive out here like this. She was a fighter, but she wasn't sure how much fight was left in her. Help, she croaked, though. She knew there was no one around to hear. She was too far out. Too far. The ocean was all-encompassing, the waves battering her, the endless water mocking her. She was so alone, so utterly alone. The surface of the water had grown impossibly distant. The sky had become a blur. She couldn't even see the shore anymore. The shark was out there, somewhere, watching. A sickening wave of dread swept over her. Please, she begged. Someone, anyone, help me. But there was nothing. Just the water, stretching forever in every direction. And then, without warning, the water around her broke once more. The shark had returned. This time, it was the last thing she would feel. Megan's head broke the surface with a violent gasp, air flooding into her lungs. But the ocean didn't offer her solace. It didn't care. She coughed, her chest burning with the effort to inhale, but her leg, her right leg, was the only thing she could focus on. Blood poured freely from the gaping wound, staining the water red as it swirled around her. She had never felt such pain. Not even in the hardest training sessions, not even in the toughest of races. This was a new kind of pain, a visceral, body-wrenching agony that cut deeper than anything she had ever known. The shark is still here. It's still here. Her brain screamed the truth, but it was too much for her to fully process. Everything was a blur. Her leg was throbbing, her body swimming in a haze of fear and shock. Megan tried to tread water, but the blood flowing from her wound made it harder. Her limbs felt heavier with each passing second, as if the ocean itself was pulling her down. The thought of the shark, it was still out there, waiting, was almost too much to bear. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the water for any sign of the predator. Nothing. Just the endless expanse of water stretching in every direction. Her mind raced. She had to get out. She had to get back to shore. She couldn't survive out here like this. Megan, Megan, a voice. Her head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wild with desperation. She couldn't believe it. Was she imagining it? The water around her still had that same unnatural stillness, that heavy presence as though something watched her from below. Megan! Hold on, I'm coming. The voice was closer now. It was real. Megan's chest heaved in an uneven rhythm as she tried to swim toward it. Her right leg was useless, the pain making her muscles lock up, but she paddled with her arms, each stroke weak, sluggish. She was drifting. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. Stay focused, keep swimming, keep moving. But the world around her was closing in, the water colder now, the waves larger, more menacing. A moment ago, there had been no one here but her and the shark, but now there was a voice and then another sound. A lifeboat engine, faint but unmistakable. Please, please, please. Megan's vision blurred as she tried to focus. Her body felt like it was slipping out of her control, her mind starting to fade as her blood continued to drain into the sea. The wound was a gaping hole, deep and jagged. The pain a constant pulse that she couldn't escape. She tried to raise her voice, but only a croak escaped her throat. It was weak, desperate, a sound barely louder than the lapping of the waves. Help! Help me! The words were barely coherent, strained and raw. She tried again, but the effort drained her. She could hear the boat's engine now, closer, louder, cutting through the vast emptiness of the ocean like a beacon of hope. But the current was pulling her away from it. She could see it, but it felt so far. She kicked harder with her good leg, but the water felt heavy, almost impossibly thick. She could barely stay afloat. She had to keep moving. Her body was a ticking clock, its seconds slipping away, but her arms were shaking, her strokes weaker, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Then she saw them. The rescue team. They were coming for her. A small motorized boat appeared in her line of sight, the engine roaring as it sliced through the water. The figure of a man, tall and muscular, stood at the front of the boat, his face covered in determination. Megan tried to raise her hand, but it felt like a colossal effort. She could see him now, and he was shouting, waving at her. "I see her! I see her!" His voice rang out, clear and firm, and the boat veered toward her, cutting through the waves in a straight line. She wasn't sure who he was. Her mind was too foggy to remember names, to remember faces. But the sight of him, of that boat, was a lifeline. He wasn't far now. He was coming. He was going to save her. But as the boat drew closer, something shifted beneath her. The water shifted in an unnatural way, the waterline rippling with a sudden, terrifying calmness. Megan's heart skipped a beat. No. The fear that had been gnawing at her returned with a vengeance. Her stomach lurched. The shark had returned. It was below her again. She didn't need to see it to know. She could feel the pressure building, the heavy weight of it, the oppressive silence beneath her. Her breath caught in her throat, the fear locking her chest tight. She looked down, desperate, hoping to see the boat coming closer, hoping that the rescuer would be there before it was too late. "Help, please!" Her voice cracked. It was barely a whisper now, but there was no time for a response. A sudden force yanked at her again, sharp, brutal, immediate. The shark. It had returned for its second strike. She screamed, or tried to. She couldn't remember if she had, but the sound was lost in the roar of the water, in the surge of blood and agony that flooded her senses. Her body was pulled under, again the water surrounding her, dark and cold, as her limbs thrashed violently, desperately. She couldn't feel her right leg anymore. The pain had drowned in the shock of being dragged back beneath the surface, pulled deeper, faster. Her lungs burned with the need to breathe, but all she could do was struggle against the pull, fight, for anything that would keep her above water. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the shark let go. Megan's head broke through the surface once more, her body completely exhausted, her movements sluggish, but she was alive. The boat was right there. The rescuer reached out a hand, his grip strong and steady as he pulled her into the boat, lifting her from the water with the strength of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Megan didn't have the energy to thank him, to speak. She could barely see straight, could barely hold on to him as he maneuvered her into the boat. "You're okay," the man said, his voice a rough, soothing balm against the chaos of the moment. He wasn't just reassuring her. He was reassuring himself. "You're okay, you're gonna be okay." Megan's vision blurred again as she collapsed against the side of the boat, her legs numb, her mind swirling with disbelief. The water around her was still dark with her blood, but she was out of it now, out of its grasp. The rescue boat sped back toward the shore, the motor roaring as it cut through the waves, but Megan couldn't focus on anything beyond the distant horizon. She had no idea how long it had taken to get to her, but she knew one thing for certain: she had survived. But the terror wasn't over. The trauma wasn't over, and the ocean would always have its shadows. The voice came again, louder, this time, cutting through the panic swirling in Megan's mind. It was a male voice, sharp, urgent. She looked toward the shore, but all she could see were the faint figures of early morning joggers in the distance. The horizon was a blur of blue and white, but there was no sign of the lifeguard station or anyone who could help her. Her chest tightened, panic creeping in again as she realized she was alone. "Megan, are you okay?" The voice came again, but this time it was closer. Megan turned her head, her heart leaping in her chest as she saw the figure cutting through the water toward her, a bright orange rescue buoy in hand. It was Jake, the lifeguard she had barely noticed earlier in the morning, the one who had been talking about the shark sightings. Now he was here, swimming toward her with an urgency that made Megan's stomach drop. Her leg felt like it was going to explode. The pain was unbearable, a constant pulsing rhythm of agony, but there was no time to focus on it. She could only think of one thing: survival. She tried to move, tried to kick her legs, but the water felt thick, each movement a struggle. She barely noticed Jake as he reached her, but she could hear him now, shouting, urging her to stay calm. "Megan, you need to hold on. I'm getting you out of here, okay?" She opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled cough came out. She was dizzy, her vision blurring at the edges. The blood from her leg kept spreading, swirling around her, but it didn't seem to matter. The water around her had turned an unnatural shade of red, and the shark had to be near, lurking in the shadows. She could feel it, a cold shiver running down her spine, but she couldn't stop herself from sinking. Her body was giving up on her. Jake reached her, his strong arms grabbing hold of her, pulling her toward the buoy. He spoke quickly, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Don't panic, Megan, you're going to be okay. Just focus on me. We've got this. You're gonna make it." He moved with an efficiency that belied his youth, his strokes, deep and controlled as he kept her afloat, her head bobbing above the water. Her right leg, the blood loss too great, felt like it was dragging her down, like it was a heavy weight she could no longer carry. She couldn't even process the idea of moving it, not with the pain, not with the sheer effort of keeping herself alive. "Jake, please." Her voice cracked as she tried to form words, but it came out weak, strained. She didn't know what she was asking for. Maybe she was begging for help, maybe she was begging for some kind of miracle, but all she could do was cling to him, trying not to slip beneath the surface again. Jake's grip tightened and he kept pulling her toward the buoy. His strokes were measured even, but the urgency was unmistakable. He knew the severity of the situation, knew how close she was to drowning, knew that every second counted. "We're going to make it. Hold on, Megan. Hold on for just a little longer." Megan could barely respond, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to breathe through the pain. The blood from her leg still seeped into the water, the gash so deep that every pulse of her heart sent more of it spiraling into the ocean around them. She could feel herself growing weaker, her limbs heavier, like she was being swallowed by the water. The thought of the shark still lingered in her mind. The way it had attacked, the force of it, the cold mechanical violence. She could still feel the press of its body against hers, the strike of its teeth. It was as if it had become a part of her, its presence lingering in every muscle, in every breath. Megan knew it could be back at any moment. "Jake, she choked out. but she couldn't finish the sentence. Her throat was raw, and the words wouldn't come. "Shh, just breathe." "I've got you," Jake said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Stay with me." He was guiding her toward the shore now, pulling her through the water with incredible strength. Megan couldn't help but wonder how he was so strong, how he was managing to drag her weight through the choppy waves when she could barely keep her head above water. But she didn't have time to think about that. She just had to hold on. The minutes dragged on in a strange, painful blur. Megan couldn't remember how long they had been in the water, how much time had passed since the shark attacked. It felt like hours, though she knew it had been no more than 30 minutes, 40 at most. The world was closing in on her. She was losing feeling in her legs, her right side completely numb, but she still kept her grip on Jake, still held onto the small sliver of hope that he would get her out of this. "Jake, please don't leave me. Please. I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, but his face was drawn tight with strain. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his breathing was heavy. He was giving everything to this rescue, everything to keeping her alive. His strokes had become less smooth now, his exhaustion creeping in, but he never faltered. "We're almost there, just a little longer." The shore seemed impossibly far away, but the more Jake pulled, the closer they got. Megan's mind swirled. She couldn't focus. Her limbs were useless, numb from blood loss and shock. The wound on her leg burned with each pulse, the pain nearly unbearable, but Jake's steady words kept her anchored, even when everything inside her wanted to slip into unconsciousness. Finally, when it felt like she couldn't keep going, she saw it. The shoreline, stretching out before them like a mirage in the distance. The faint silhouettes of people had come closer. Joggers who had turned into watchers, now noticing the scene unfolding in the water. Some had their phones out, some were pointing, but they were too far away to be of any use. Megan knew the nearest help was still far beyond their reach. And then, at last, Jake's arms wrapped around her in a sudden, powerful pull, lifting her toward the sand. With a final desperate lunge, Jake dragged her onto the beach, her body collapsing beneath her. Megan gasped, the taste of salt water still heavy on her tongue. She could barely see through the haze of pain and exhaustion, but she could hear voices now, shouting, frantic. People were surrounding them, lifting her body, but the world felt blurry. She could barely feel her leg anymore. She could barely feel anything. She looked up at Jake, her eyes wide with gratitude, but she couldn't find the words. She was so tired. Jake's face was grim, his hands shaking as he pulled away from her to wave for help. The others had gathered, some kneeling beside her, one already calling for an ambulance. "We're going to need a stretcher," someone said. "She's bleeding out." Megan's heart skipped a beat. Bleeding out? Her mind barely processed the words. She closed her eyes, feeling the cool sand beneath her, hearing the distant sound of a siren growing louder. Everything was slipping away. "Megan," Jake said softly, kneeling beside her, "stay with me. You're gonna be okay. They're coming. Just stay with me." But it was so hard. Everything felt distant, far away. Her body felt like it was no longer hers. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore became muffled, as if coming from a dream. The last thing she remembered was Jake's voice, calm and insistent, as he promised her that she would make it. Then everything went dark.